Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special bonus episode of Creating Space. We are here to create space for compelling and complex conversations as it relates to Christianity, faith, following Jesus. I'm your host, Scott Lackey, and if there's something you'd like to hear us talk about on the podcast, just send me an email at scottlackey@newstorybuffalo.com. Please like the podcast, subscribe, and share it with others, but send me an email if there's something you have a question about, something you'd like to hear me do some research on or bring a guest on for. Just pop a question over. No question is off limits for this podcast platform. We want to be able to dig into all kinds of complex conversations. And today, I'm really excited. I have a friend of mine on the podcast, and this is our first two-time guest on the podcast, Dr. Scot McKnight. He's been a professor of New Testament for more than 4 decades. He is author of more than 90 books, including the award-winning Jesus Creed and the King Jesus Gospel. Welcome back, Scott.
Well, Scott, good to be with you. Good to see you. And I'm honored to be the first two-time guest. So this is fun.
You hold the record right now. You hold the record. Maybe like on Saturday Night Live, you'll be a part of the 5-Timers Club for Creating Space one day.
I will imitate Father Guido Sarducci. Did you know who Father Guido?
I do know who Father.
I loved Father Guido Sarducci.
He was a special Weekend Update guest, correct? Back in the day.
And he would always be tapping his cigarette. Tapping his cigarette. Oh, he was hilarious. Remember, he had to take the Pope Mobile through the streets of Rome because nobody's coming to church. We're going to go to the people. He had a big, I think it was a big statue of the Pope in the back of a truck or something.
Oh. Now, were you around? Did you ever watch In the Years of the Church Lady? Did you like her?
I don't remember the church lady, probably, but we loved Rosanna Dana.
Oh, I love Rosanna Dana. Gilda Radner.
Gilda Radner, we loved her, yeah.
Yeah, she was great. That was a great cast. I actually, as a kid, I was obsessed with Saturday Night Live, and I bought those first 5 seasons when they came out on DVD. I was just sorting through them yesterday. I have all of them. Some of the things that they got away with were innovative, and some of them were downright offensive, but it was a creative show nonetheless.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah,
it was good. Well, today we're here to talk about your new book that was co-authored with Adrienne Gibson called Traumatized Church, what Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church teaches us about helping those who are hurting. I've already read this book. I read it, I think last week. I received an early copy. I'd recommend this book to all of our listeners. I found it to be very helpful and insightful. And thank you, Scott, for writing this book with Adrienne.
Well, thanks. And yeah, thanks very much to Adrienne, because it would never have been written had it not been for her writing her thesis on trauma and the New Testament. And when I was reading it, I said to Chris, my wife is a psychologist, and I said, this thesis needs to be published. And because it introduces people to what trauma is, just the basics. And trauma is a big part of church life, whether people recognize it or not. Now, there are plenty of churches who think trauma is woke, and that's an allegation that shouldn't be said by a pastor, but it is. And they think this is just a kitschy term that people are now using. But this is a very, very serious issue, and there are a lot of people in churches who have been traumatized in their life. And pastors and leaders, let's say teachers, people who perform in front of people, if they are not aware of what trauma is, they are going to be re-traumatizing people in the church. They didn't intend to do it, but they will. So this is why I said this thesis has to be published, and I'd love to work with you. And then I discovered some things that I could contribute to it. So there we go.
It felt like this book was almost a continuation of some of your more recent work, as if there was Tove, Pivot, and Invisible Jesus, and those all kind of focused on how a leader can traumatize lay people within the church, or hurt lay people within the church, or abuse lay people. This one does address that, but it took a bit of a different angle as well on how a pastor can actually be traumatized or hurt by a church. Did this at all feel like a full circle kind of conversation or moment for you?
Scott, that's a good expression for it. And I haven't used that, but that is exactly how I felt. I thought, now there's going to be some people who have been really helped by the Tove book or the Pivot or the Invisible Jesus book, who were traumatized in churches by leaders who are going to say, now you're siding with the pastors and they're going to use this book against us now. And I'm afraid that some will. I can't control that. But trauma goes in both directions. Traumatized people can traumatize others, and lay people, congregants, can traumatize pastors. And I know so many pastors who've been traumatized. In fact, Scott, I've been in places in the last year since I've been working on this book where I've been speaking, and I started bringing up the topic, and I've seen pastors in the audience with tears in their eyes because I'm talking their language. I'm expressing what they have experienced in their own churches, and they're really glad to hear someone taking their side. Now, this is not really a book about pastors. We talk about leaders, we talk about people in the church, but ordinary people in the church, teaching a Sunday school class, can be traumatized by Sunday school classes, by other people who are criticizing what they're teaching. And so this is broader than pastors, but and leaders in a church. But I think that there'll be plenty of leaders who say this, you're talking our language here. But anyone who's been traumatized will like all of Adrienne's discussions that she brought into the book on what trauma is. And they will say, well, your idea that the Apostle Paul was traumatized makes me wonder if I might not like this guy a little bit, because I haven't liked him in my life. There's been a lot of this I've heard over the years. And I think Paul was an extraordinarily vulnerable man. And that's the part that I contributed to the book. And then we worked every one of the chapters together. She was a little bit more nervous about editing what I wrote about Paul, but I wasn't so nervous about editing her, because if I couldn't understand it, I thought we got to work on this. So it was a really fruitful dialectical relationship as we worked through this book together. And I learned a lot. And as I talked to some of my students, some of whom are pastors and some who aren't, they had stories to tell.
They did. It was crazy reading those stories. I've been in ministry a little over 10 years now, and we started a church 6 years ago. And I have had a great experience as a church planter. The Lord's been very good to us. But the stories that you were sharing, while I personally have not been in the seat of some of those people, now with Pivot and Tove and some of my previous church experiences before we planted the church, I was like, oh, I've sat in some of those seats before. But with this particular book, I was thinking, man, I know so many friends, pastoral colleagues and friends who could benefit from this book, ministry leaders who could benefit from this book. Because while I have, in our 6 years of church planting, not yet experienced some of what you're describing in the book, I know if you're a pastor or ministry leader listening to this right now, and once again, this book is for so many others, but please get this book, because the stories you share are real stories.
Yeah, they are. I sent my manuscript. I first wrote about a 20,000 word manuscript on trauma and Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And then I added stuff about Corinth. And I sent this to 6 pastors, 6 friends of mine. Some of them pastors, some are professors. And half a dozen pastors have said to me, I feel like you were a fly on the wall in our church, listening to stories being told.
Mm-hmm.
And the beginning of my commentaries on 1st and 2nd Corinthians for the Everyday Bible Study, I talk about this kind of dynamic in churches. And so, these are real stories, and I know these people, and I've heard stories from them that I could not publish, that kind of make my blood curl, but in a different way. It's like, I grieve for people in churches who've been traumatized by other Christians. And I think that's the heartbeat of this book. And that's the heartbeat of Adrienne, to help traumatized people heal, and find safe spaces, like you're calling it spaces, finding trauma safe spaces
Mm.
in churches.
Let's talk about this word trauma for just a moment. As you said, some people mischaracterize the word as woke or this or that. Uh, how do you and Adrienne define this word trauma?
Well, everybody uses Judith Herman, who wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery almost 30 years ago, and it's still the Bible for defining trauma. And I'll give her a definition, then I'm going to give some terms. She defines trauma as a traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. Okay, now here's the term. This is very important. Trauma is a response. You can say that an event, let's say you are in Iran, or you're in an abusive family situation. The event of abuse or war or bombing or death is not the same thing as trauma. You could call it a traumatic event, I think. I'll have to ask Adrienne. But trauma is a response to something, an experience or an event. So all of a sudden it becomes subjective. And it is a response that overwhelms. It goes beyond a person's. Doesn't mean if it does to everybody. It overwhelms a person's ability to cope. And then it affects a person's sense of security and safety. So one of the most important words in trauma therapy and in trauma studies is safety. People have to find a place that's safe. So it's a response to an event or an experience that overwhelms and affects a person's identity or safety. So in other words, it is subjective. If you say, well, that's your feelings, that's your subject. Yes, exactly. That's what trauma is. It's a sense. All right, now I'll give you an example. We got a new car about 10 years ago, a Toyota Camry. I think the first day Chris was driving right downtown in our village, and someone pulled out of a driveway without looking and whacked and drove into her.
Oh.
All right, so now and Chris, she's a therapist, so she'll say, I'm traumatized, so you got to deal with this. If we're driving down the street and someone pulls up quickly on the right, she gets triggered. That's the term everybody uses. She feels that this is going to happen again. That's what we mean, that it's subjective and it's perceptive. All right. For some people to go downtown New York City or Dallas or Chicago or LA is traumatizing because they've read so many things about murders and violence and theft. We were in South Africa, and people who were driving never stopped at stop signs. And I said, why do you not stop? They said, because if there's people in the corner, they may open the car door, throw us out, and steal the car and drive across the town. Then we'll have to go pick it up. So all of a sudden, we're in a car, we're looking around thinking, don't stop. This is a new experience for us. So it's subjective, it's perceptive, and it's also embodied. So it's something that a person feels in the body. All right. Now, okay, let's just say that you have been a longtime member at a church that you grew to love, or you were a worker at an institution that you loved, and then things went south. You lost your job, you quit, however it happens. When you go back into that space, many times, all the feelings of the bad feelings that happened, that terminated the employment or ended the employment or you walked away, come back to you. That's embodied trauma. It's a re-traumatizing. And then finally, it's connected to memory. Memory is a part of this, is that you could be speaking in your church on a Sunday, and you might bring up the story of one of your favorite writers, preachers, someone you really like. Okay. some story you tell. Maybe you don't like them that much, but it was a good story. The name that you mentioned for some people may trigger personal experiences that they've had with that person, or that someone that they liked imposed that person's ideas on them in a violent or coercive way that led them to be traumatized. And so, you didn't try to do anything. You just did what you thought was you just told a story. You used a name. You quoted a book.
Yeah.
Right. Now, in this, when we wrote Tove, okay, after Tove was written, 2 letters came to either Laura or me. I think they both came to me, but it doesn't matter. Of people who said, the story that you tell positively of that person, I know, and that person was abusive to me. In the second printing, we removed those names and those stories because we heard things. All right. I thought it was a good story, and it really was. I remember one of them, I thought, this is a really good example of what we're looking for, of a positive response. But this person experienced that same person at that same church in a different setting in a completely different way, and it re-traumatized that person. So that's the memory that is involved. And Scott, good leaders in churches, good pastors, have to be so trauma sensitive and aware when they tell stories and when they say things. This is not my natural gift. I'm more of a professor. I sit in the classroom. I tell people what I think. If they don't like it, that's the way it is. You could disagree with me. I'm not going to be bothered by that. I've been doing this more than 40 years, and people disagree with me, and I disagree with them, and we can go at it. But now I've taught in my last few years teaching at Northern Seminary, and now teaching at both Houston and in Westminster in England. There has been an increasing number of female students in my classes. Now, I think this is characteristic of seminaries who aren't in the complementarian world. Okay, so, and what I've learned is that women in seminary classes are often on a path. They've been in a trauma zone, and they've been on a path of healing far more than I thought. And I have learned immensely from them. One time I was teaching a class. It was majority female. I think it's the first time that's ever happened to me. And I've taught, now, when I taught undergrad, clearly that happened, but in seminaries. 9 women in the class had experienced trauma from a male, almost all of them from pastors. They responded to topics in ways I never expected in my life. All right. So, for instance, we can talk about cruciformity, suffering intentionally in order to bolster someone else. Does not sound the same to a woman who's been abused by a leader as it does to someone who's an apostle of Jesus in the first century. And so, you learn to be more sensitive, and you just hope you don't make really stupid mistakes and ruin the situation with people. But if we become alert to how trauma works with these terms, response, overwhelms, effects, subjective, perceptive, embodied, and memory, when we become alert to this, we become more sensitive, and we create trauma-sensitive spaces. And people who have been traumatized detect trauma safe just like that. They know that this space is going to be safe for them. And that's what our book hopes to do, help create trauma safe spaces.
Can you walk us through the trauma responses of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, and how they map onto Paul?
Now, you got to know that this is
some of this is Adrienne.
This is Adrienne's turf. I don't even have those terms in my I have them somewhere in my notes, but
Let's jump to your turf, because there's a place here that I think is clearly your turf. We can go back to
oh
fight,
yeah,
flight, freeze, and fawn, but I really liked the section when you were pointing out the ways in which the church at Corinth criticized Paul
yeah.
for
Okay,
being
I got them in my notes. All right.
okay.
Okay. All
We
right.
can get there,
Yeah.
but I thought this was helpful too, because one of the things you do in this book, in seeing Paul through a traumatized lens, is I really respect that you're saying, I'm going to try to look at Paul from a little bit of a different angle, because somebody like yourself who's been teaching the New Testament for 4 decades might say, I know Paul.
Yeah. Yeah.
There might be a temptation to go, I know Paul. I know how I teach Paul. I know how I see Paul. I know how I view Paul. But I sense the humility here in your work where you're saying there's this other layer that I haven't seen before, and now I'm seeing it. And in the ways of Corinth criticized him for being fickle, two-faced, not looking the part, mediocre, not playing the part, playing favorites, no longer being special. How do you
Yeah.
think these critiques affected Paul and contributed to a
Yeah.
traumatic experience?
Yeah. Um, um, Here's what happened. Adrienne's thesis made me alert. So I kept that definition of Judith Herman around, and I learned a lot from Adrienne about what it is, and these terms that I've used, although I've clarified those over time. Um, um, when I started writing, especially for Second Corinthians for the Everyday Bible Study, and when I got to chapters 10 through 13, I I said to myself, this guy's been traumatized.
Mm.
Now, I had some categories for it, and I didn't exploit this in the little commentary. I mean, I'd like to rewrite it. No, I don't. It takes a lot of time to do those. Um, I got other things right now, but I thought this guy's been traumatized. So I wanted to sort this out, and I mentioned that I sent a 20,000 word or so manuscript to some friends of mine. I had written this up, but in the process, I thought I'm gonna find out if other people have worked on this topic. Well, I found an article by a scholar, last name of Clark, which is a good name in your family.
Yes, it is.
His last name is Clark, and he has a degree in psychology and theology or New Testament studies. He diagnosed Paul in Second Corinthians as having PTSD. And I thought, I totally agree with this because now this is a psychologist who knows his stuff. I was seeing this and feeling this, and I I I know Tom Wright, for instance, says when you read 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 in your Greek New Testament, there's just things going on here that's not typical of Paul, that are
Mhm.
not typical. And there's language that he's jumpy and he's irritated and agitated, and it comes through with the grammar, the incomplete sentences, the sudden changes and flipping around. And my favorite illustration, he says, "I'm not defending myself." Well, you sure do know that he is defending himself, or he wouldn't be saying, "I'm not defending myself." That's the only people who say, "I'm not defending myself," know that they're coming off like they're defending themselves. And that's what Paul was going through. So, what I thought I'd do is come up with a list that I think is pretty clear in the text of where Paul is defending himself, and recognize that in every one of these, I'm convinced, and this is not new to me, Paul is responding to criticisms that have come his way.
Mm.
And this is these four chapters, 10 through 13. If you read them and you say, now, as I read this, I want to think of Corinthians making allegations against the Apostle Paul, you'll come up with a list. And some people might come up with a list of 15 things. And I tried to keep it to within limits, and so I kept it to 7. But Paul was criticized for various things. And one of the things I emphasize, because there's such an amazing book on this by a guy named Isaac Soon, is that Paul was demeaned by the Corinthians because of his physical stature.
Mhm.
And when you start putting things together, that Paulos, the Greek name for Paul, which is not his Hebrew name, Shaul or Saul is his other name, this word means tiny. And even if you, now some people say he picked up Paulos because it sounds like Saulos, and so therefore that's how he, or that when he was in the Gentile world he used a Gentile name. But why this name when it means tiny? I mean, it's like saying you're a point guard in a basketball team, or you can only be a gymnast, or you got to do something for small people, play golf. All right, so but in the 2nd century, there's a text that describes the Apostle Paul as mikros, and that's where we get the word, little, tiny, small, micro size, and that he had curved legs. Now, that word that's used for Paul of curved legs is a word that is used in the diagnosis of people in the ancient world for dwarfism. Now, so my daughter writes me the other day and she says, well, Dad, how tall do you think the Apostle Paul was? I said, all right, the average person, I think in Paul's day, I think they say is somewhere between 5'2" and 5'6", the average male. All right. Paul was probably somewhere around 4'6" to 4'8". Now, my mother was 5'2", and she was little. All right, so Paul was very little. Now, not super little. I mean, for our day, if he grew up in Serbia, he'd be a really little guy because they seem to all be tall. At least that's the ones we see in the NBA. So Paul was small, and small people were degraded in Paul's world as unworthy of leadership because they couldn't command in the military setting. They wouldn't have enough strength to be the guy. So that is one of them, and and they accused him of being this is one that I think is really nasty, is that he was a mediocre talent. His letters, they say, are weighty and forceful, but in person he's unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. 2 Corinthians 10:10. Now, you preach, okay? I teach, I preach. What happens to you when someone comes up after the sermon and says something like, I've heard a lot better sermons in my life than the one you gave today? Or what I got one time when I was really young, I don't know why I was asked to preach. I was like a seminary freshman. Someone said, you might make a good preacher someday. I was very kind, and at the same time, quite a barb. But you got to know that when you tell someone that they're bad speakers, you're in the wrong calling, you shouldn't be a pastor, that's going to wound them. Now, here's Paul writing years later. And in this section of this letter, 4 chapters, he brings up at least 7 criticisms because these things wake him up at night in anxiety and anger. These are things that he's responding to. He gets sarcastic. Sarcasm is an expression of anger. He gets sarcastic in these chapters. So there's just a tone of pain. And what I like about this, Scott, is the Apostle Paul was extremely vulnerable. I would say this, especially in the seminary class, to people like you. If you talk like this from your pulpit, you're going to lose your job, because this is just too much. You're getting right in these people's faces.
Mm-hmm.
So how did Paul respond? Now I'll get to these terms. Okay. The terms that we use in that psychologists, trauma experts used are fight. Now this is connected to hyperarousal. That means your anxiety level, your blood pressure, everything's going up, is they fight back.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of Paul's instincts was to fight back. And he knew it. He was tough in that sense. He wanted to defend himself. And of course, he had to tell people he wasn't defending himself. But that's one of his responses. And chapters 10 through 13, Paul refers to a letter that he wrote as a severe or painful letter.
Mm.
A lot of people think chapters 10 through 13 are that severe letter, and it's attached to 2 Corinthians 1 through 7, and then 8 through 9 is about raising money, etc., and then 10 through 13. So there's 3 major sections in this letter anyway. But whether it's a severe letter or not, that's not the point. The point is that Paul fought back. A second thing is is flight. People flee to safety when they're wounded.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way God made us. Everybody does this. If there's some kind of fire that sets off, we run from it. If there's an incoming missile and you're in Ukraine, you don't look up and say, let's go see what's going on. You run to safety. We just, in the last week, we've had 2 tornado warnings in our area, and Chris and I have come to the basement both times because we flee to safety.
Mm-hmm.
Paul fled from the Corinthians to Ephesus, and he wrote his letters from there, or probably one from Troas or over in Thessaloniki. So Paul has fled, and we know he fled because when he was in Ephesus, in a sense, he had promised that he'd visit, or they wanted him to visit, and he would send Titus or Timothy to go do the work for him because he knew they weren't going to respond affirmatively. So he fled these people. Now, those are 2 hyper-arousal responses. Now, hypo-arousals are sort of like you're flattening out. You are, I'm not sure the psychology term, but you are backing off. Let's say you're surrendering. You're capitulating. All right. And some people cave, they freeze and they just can't do anything. And I'll say this. I think there are far too many Christians in the United States right now who don't know what to say about the political situation, so they're saying nothing. But saying nothing is complicity. These are the bystanders in Germany's Hitler's time, when people just we can't fight this guy, so we're just going to go along with whatever they tell us to do. And this happens in really nasty ways also in churches when a leader is abusive or too powerful or threatening, and people just say, I'll just don't fight him. You'll get fired. I need the job. My wife or my life depends upon it. My children need this money. This is how we're paying for our son to go to college. So they just refuse to resist something that they know is wrong, and that's a form of freezing. Now, fawning is to capitulate in a way of cooperation, and I call Paul's section in 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 on suffering, I call it gospel fawning. The Corinthians wanted Paul to brag like anybody else, to boast. This word boast appears all the time in these chapters. They wanted him to boast about his skills. So when you were a Roman Corinthian leader and you showed up, the first thing you did is read your curriculum vitae or a list of accomplishments. I know a professor who on the first day of class pulled out his curriculum vitae, his resume, and read his accomplishments in order to convince the students that they should listen to him. And I said, no, you don't need to do this. You don't need to do this. They know this already because you're a professor. But that's sort of a Roman approach to life. Paul refused to boast in his accomplishments, though he had plenty to boast about. Instead, he boasted about his suffering. And in chapter 11, he goes on and on and on about all the bad things that have happened to him. This is a guy who had bruises and cuts and scars and broken bones and a malformed body. I mean, I can't imagine what he looked like. I mean, he was beaten with rods a few times, and that's going to leave whelps and scars on the back of your body, infections. I mean, how do you survive in that world when you don't know medicine? And water is, I guess you can get in the ocean, but even the ocean water is not necessarily going to be good for your cuts and scars. So Paul boasts about these things, and this is how he responded to his trauma. He fought at times. He fled at times. I don't think Paul froze. He may have. You may see fleeing as a form of freezing. And I think he chose not to fawn in that way, but he fought back by gospel fawning and said, I'm going to brag about my suffering, and I'm going to say that this is what living for Christ is like, and being conforming to Christ is like. So those are the way I approached it. I don't know how. I've had some Corinthian and Pauline specialists read it, and they've been very encouraging about this approach to Paul. And those who are Pauline specialists, who are pastors, agree with me, and that's been encouraging.
Let's real quickly, because you've been so generous with your time, let's respond to two possible pushbacks or critiques. You've already alluded to these a little bit, but lean into this a little bit specifically for those who are listening. What would you say to the pastor or ministry leader who believes trauma has become a buzzword and should be something that, hey, do we really need to be talking about this? It feels like everybody's using this word right now. What would you say to them?
Well, everybody's using this word because this word makes sense to a lot of people's experiences. So I think it's unwise for leaders in churches to say this is a buzzword, we're going to ignore it. Okay, so first I would say it's insensitive. The second thing that's more important is it's pastorally egregious to people who've been traumatized to be told that this is just a buzzword. I mean, it is the height of hubris and a lack of pastoral care to treat people who've been traumatized by saying that this is just a buzzword. Now, I think I'd be willing to say this. There are some people who have climbed on to the trauma mat and like to say they've been traumatized when they really don't even understand it. It's like the way people use gaslighting or terms like that. You know, it's
Right.
You go, okay, all right. But my experience in, let's say, a decade of being aware of this and listening to students in classes and people in congregations when I bring up this topic, I have not met one person that I think is faking that they've been traumatized. So I would say it's not only insensitive and pastorally egregious, I would say it is out of kilter with a reality that I've experienced in churches with people, is that people who are going to use this term are risking themselves to say they've been traumatized because it will require them to tell a story. And they may not want to tell. They probably are going to decide right now, I'm not telling that person my story if they think that this is just a buzzword. So I think, and the other thing I would say is this: Jesus majored in holistic redemption of traumatized people. Just read Matthew chapters 8-9, and you'll see that Jesus seems to find people, and people found Jesus who were living in the trauma zone.
And there's, I think that leads into the second potential pushback that some may have. You talk about this holistic redemption. And so the question would be, is there a possibility for healing for people who've been traumatized? Or is trauma something they'll carry for the rest of their lives? How do we, as pastors, walk through that with people? How do we navigate that conversation where we say, hey, Christ is your healer, but also at the same time you have this trauma. How do we handle that in a gracious and shepherding way, but also perhaps encourage people to move forward? How do you do that?
Yeah, this is really important, Scott, and this is exactly what Adrienne writes about. There's an organization, I don't know, I can tell you it's SAMHSA are the initials, and it's a national institute that works on trauma and healing, and they talk about the things that need to be in place. Let's say to make a place a safe space, a trauma sensitive and trauma alert and trauma safe space, like safety, boundaries, trust and transparency, mutuality, agency, cultural awareness, humility. All these things are involved. But the first thing I would say is yes, people can heal from this. Jesus was a master of this. Trauma therapists know what they're doing, and we need to read trauma therapists. And that's why I was so grateful when Adrienne was willing to go along with me to write this book, is that she has been doing this for 20 years, has been she's a specialist in trauma therapy. And she knows that there are ways to create spaces where people can begin to feel safe again and to be able to tell their story, to become transparent and vulnerable so that they can look inside, see what's happened, and then get through it by the power of God, grace, the Holy Spirit, and loving community of people who trust and will work with them. So yes, I think it's possible, but I think churches, look, Scott, you've heard me say this before. Platforms in churches attract people who want to have a persona and perform on that platform and become a celebrity. There's a lot of this in churches. Those people are not sensitive.
Uh-huh.
But people who are genuine pastors are sensitive to the pain of other people, and they don't know when the day begins what different kinds of pain and trauma might show up in the people they talk to.
Uh-huh.
But they have empathic skills of empathy, and they're empathic. They have skills of sympathy. They have skills of pastoral care that helps these people. They know when they need to hear a word of grace from some, let's say, gospel people, and they know when the person needs to go see a trauma therapist. So I think it's possible to heal, but I think it is difficult. It takes time, and it requires a lot of safe space. And if a church is going to be a healing space, that church needs to become trauma aware and trauma sensitive and trauma safe by learning what it is and how the gospel impacts people who've been traumatized.
Yeah, I remember when we started our church, there was a local group doing some training through some of Diane Langberg's curriculum of how to create a space like that within your church. They're very helpful and great insight. I really appreciate that. As we're coming to a close here, if there's anyone right now listening, specifically if there's maybe a pastor or ministry leader right now who's wrestling with trauma, I know your book is for everybody who's dealing with trauma in the church world and even beyond that. But if there's a pastor or ministry leader right now who's dealing with trauma, do you have a word of encouragement or an insight or a suggestion that you would encourage them to lean into just a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think that we need to realize that the gospel, that God, that Jesus Christ, that the power of the Holy Spirit is available for people to be healed from their trauma. And we need to open ourselves up to those healing forces and powers of the grace of God. And I think that people will realize that, okay, I've known a lot of pastors in my life. There are some pastors that I know, and you just know, that's a pastor who's going to have wounded people in their church, and they're going to be pastoring to. I'm thinking of a pastor right now in Texas that I know. And I just know this guy has great skills with other people. And when someone is hurt, he seems to know that, and he's right there with them. And that's what we can do in the church. We can surround ourselves with people who are sensitive to the traumatized and create spaces and churches and places that are for the traumatized, and they will feel safe and they will find healing, and they'll experience the grace of God in ways that they would never have thought could happen in a church.
Amen. Scot McKnight, thanks for joining us and coming on here to talk about Traumatized Church. This is a meaningful and powerful message, and I know this book is going to help so many people, and the link will be to it in the show notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Great to be with you and see you.
And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into this special bonus episode of Creating Space. Order a copy of Traumatized Church. Read it. Leave a good review for Scott and Adrienne as well. And thank you for listening. If there's anything you'd like to hear us talk about on the podcast, send me an email to scottlackey@newstorybuffalo.com. Please like the podcast, share, subscribe with others. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of Creating Space.